so excited to have this time to chat together. Since we've met through the unique channels through which our relationship was established, I've just been astonished by the breadth and scope of your philosophical and intellectual concerns. So it's amazing just to have this chance to hang out together and share some of the stuff so that others can perhaps benefit or enjoy our conversation. Recent conversation, a couple people were very excited and they were like, I just wish I had the chance to engage in conversations like that. So hopefully there's some vicarious distribution of the spirit,
right,
or conversations. So you and I this morning, we had, I gave a complex overview of recent developments in what we might call the disclosure, quote unquote, situation, as it has transformed and progressed, particularly since the allegations of David Grush in approximately May or June of last year. And we talked about Grush's allegations, Diana Walsh-Pasulka, Dr. Pasulka. We talked about some of Gary Nolan's concerns and comments. We began with talking a little bit about Jacques Vallée. And let's see, what else did we cover? I talked a little bit about the implications of any branch of any group of humans who might be in possession of alien or non-human artifacts, vehicles, or intelligence related to non-human intelligences. And then a little bit about the bill that I think partially passed. I don't actually know the status of that bill at the moment. And a little bit about the congressional hearings involving the two fighter pilots and David Grush. And you had some very important concerns about the entire affair. If you please take a moment and outline those concerns and some of your thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, most of that was news to me because I think I chose to remain ignorant of recent developments after my investigation of what happened in 2017.
And what happened in 2017?
The Pentagon UFO videos.
Right.
Yeah.
Keep going. I'm just going to close this window so we get less car noise and more you sound.
Yeah, so I mean, my only concern is really with counterintelligence, and parsing what in the modern UFO disclosure movement originates from what I would consider to be a genuinely scientific enterprise and what appears to be masquerading as something scientific under the guise of some kind of elaborate continuity of operations plan of some kind, which tends to be my default suspicion.
Mm-hmm.
That I find that helps me orient my perspective.
You spoke a little bit earlier about concerns related to an apparatus for control of the humans. The opposite, the paradox of disclosure as you saw it, and also the problematical features of a structure in which the humans are constantly appealing to some kind of authority structure and or maybe an ersatz religion in hope of a transcendent solution, to climate change and energy scarcity and ecological devastation and war and disease and so on. So yeah, feel free to just again, circle us around some of your concerns and insights around this.
Yeah, I mean, disclosure is somewhat self-contradictory in the sense that what I think would inevitably be disclosed is that our approach to the acquisition of scientific knowledge as well as the idea of some kind of authoritative transmission of information, would both be undermined, I think. So the essence of disclosure would be the revelation that our approach to science itself is misguided. So that disclosure, I think, would be intrinsically liberating in the sense that, we need to forego this fixation on technological solutions. So my only concern is that insofar as we believe in these authoritative transmissions of information, we set ourselves up to be maybe exploited or predicted or controlled, given the complex catastrophes that might be in store for us imminently. So I tend to suspect some kind of continuity of government or business operations beneath these sophisticated counterintelligence experiments, which really seem to be what some of these accounts reveal. So as soon as I began to suspect that, I started to disconnect.
From the topic and the news surrounding it and the hullabaloo.
Yeah, because I felt like I was seeing the same kind of game enacted again and again. So
yes.
Once I felt like I understood the game plan, I stopped fixating on it. And that was just my own choice.
Well, a self-protective choice, obviously. In order for us to have the wherewithal and the psychological and intellectual hygiene necessary to pursue rich and deep concerns with insight, understanding, the reconciliation of what we consider to be valuable knowledge in the direction that removes the occlusions that our culture and society place there, right? In order to be sort of athletically capable of such things, we can't be hauling around a dross of misinformation, disinformation, psyops, conspiracy theories, all of these things.
Right. Yeah.
But I want to step through some of the features of what you have proposed here, which I find astonishingly clarifying and clear-minded. Whether or not it is what we should take to be the case, it's profoundly important. I think it's a perspective that had never occurred to me in such a clear way prior to our discussion, and with which I was deeply impressed. So I'm going to try to paraphrase back to you some of my understanding. Paradoxically, when we hear this word disclosure, what we think is what we are likely to think. Hang on a moment. We're likely to think something resembling, now the organs of power in the government and the military are going to do us the incredible favor of coming clean to us about the history of their knowledge of interactions with non-human intelligence, UFOs, recovered vehicles, biologics, reverse engineering, free energy, universal love, you name it, right? I think the last one's kind of a joke. So when we hear this phrase disclosure, this is what we're thinking. The authorities will finally give forth with the truth about the sky beings or the, interdimensional travelers that have been interacting with us.
Right.
And you are saying, not only would that not represent a useful disclosure, what actually needs to be disclosed is the incredible, confusing, obfuscating lies that have comprised our understandings about science, nature, existence, ontology, epistemology, and so forth, right? Like an actual disclosure would free us from a long history of slave-making, prisoneering agendas by 19 different factions among the humans who, or impossible cahoots with other intelligences, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's a huge mess. So yeah, feel free to elaborate, correct, or just talk about some of that.
Like continuing to petition surrogate authority figures is part of the problem.
Beautiful.
Right. So
beautiful.
I think disclosure would undermine that entire approach to information or knowledge. Yeah. So,
are you using disclosure in a special personal meaning here? Just when you say disclosure would undermine, do you mean the disclosure I was talking about, or do you mean actual disclosure?
no, I think what you were.
Okay, great. Yeah, please continue about that then.
Yeah.
How would disclosure undermine that?
So in my view, I see technology, mythology, and language as being interconnected in our evolution and in our history, which modern science reflects back in a certain sense. So disclosure, I think, would necessarily reveal that relationship. So
it would reveal the deceptive underpinnings of the structures of authority which we are used to both authorizing, believing, celebrating, hoping for relief from, hoping for rescue from, and so please continue.
And part of our predicament, part of our enslavement, I think, is bound up with the fact that technology is a kind of concealment of this more primeval loss. So the idea that disclosure consists in the revelation of something technological is like intrinsically problematic for me. So I immediately become skeptical whenever I think about, if only, this surrogate authority figure reveals some novel, technological artifact, then, all of our energy crises can be solved overnight. And I don't necessarily buy into that religious myth. I mean, it's a religious narrative. I think it's one of the foundations of our entrapment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see. So a broad array of obfuscating lies, right, fictions,
Right.
that have long been promulgated, curated, purposefully curated, and developed to keep our species and the citizens and so on in this bizarre situation of being beholden to authorities that have no authority, actually, have no intrinsic authority. They are fictional authorities with a fictional library of prisoneering lies that they want us to swallow.
Yeah.
And so the idea that they like trot out the UFOs and the aliens,
right.
and go like, we are the purveyors of the information about the non-human intelligences, and now we're going to validate the strange ideas, and
it's an attempt to seize control.
Right.
When the actual revelation is that their authority is illegitimate.
Right. That's brilliant.
That's why it's
oh my god.
Yeah.
That's why it's so ironic. Yeah. Wow, that's incredible, because I think many of us are sitting around thinking, this will be the true revelation that will penetrate the fictions and establish a new vision of what it means to be human, and what the sky beings, or the ultra dimensionals, and the ultra terrestrials possibly, and the underground bases on Mars, and the gigantic underground structures in the United States built by devices produced by reverse engineering alien technologies that I'm laughing at these things, but I don't actually know the status of any of them. There could be vast underground labyrinths, in a way not entirely dissimilar to what people like Stephen Greer proposes. I don't know. I have no idea what the military-industrial complex has been up to over the past 60 years, in secrecy, for example. But it does seem, one of the things that seems wildly unlikely is that any existing structure within the government is sophisticated enough to be able to tell us what's going on, right? Even if they had vehicles and information and bodies and intelligence, I find it wildly unlikely, particularly given the stories we've heard about when they bring someone in to study something and what happens when that goes on. And those stories can be highly curated themselves. We don't know. So, if I understand you correctly, you're extremely skeptical about the idea of a disclosure involving some technological revelation, right?
Yep.
And that looks to you like a continuance of a long-standing operation, a continuance of a series of intentions on the parts of wildly untrustworthy features of our government and society, which we would have to be insane to take seriously and trust.
Yes.
Right? We would be signing up for evisceration of our sanity and perhaps capacity to understand anything if we signed up for that.
Yes.
These are the least trustworthy people to be telling us narratives about anything at all, let alone the origins of time, space, or organisms, or intelligence, or anything like that. And so anything that they trot out is necessarily not merely pre-compromised, but intentionally compromising, with very few, if any, exceptions. And so an actual disclosure would have little to do with some sort of technological revelation, but might involve the revelation of the peculiarly occlusive and deceptive and disorienting fictions that have long ridden, like sort of hitchhiked on what we call scientific endeavor, but is actually a broad array of deceptively motivated and deceptively back narratized. Like, we've got the wrong narrative about how these things developed historically. The domineering branches of these narratives are untrustworthy and confused in many cases, particularly those cases that inspire us to expect mechanistic, materialistic, reductionist. I'm sort of citing my own biases here, just to be clear. I'm not claiming these are yours. Explanation of phenomenon, cause and effect, the nature of things, and so on. And you've spoken previously, and I'd love to hear more about this, of something related to what you have called a lost symbol.
Right.
And it's sort of replacement by other behaviors and things. Please,
Right.
Please elucidate.
Yeah, well, we can, certainly delve into that.
Excellent. At your leisure.
Yeah, so in my interpretation of the history of technology, what we call utility derives from an even more arcane loss of something symbolic. So this is why I mentioned that technology, mythology, and language appear to be interwoven developments. They actually involve each other.
Mm-hmm.
And we can parse them, but I think they really constitute a single development within human evolution.
Mm.
So the symbol precedes the utility of the object that we call technological. But the eclipse of that symbol is what yields utility in history.
Wow.
So,
Help us understand the structure of that perspective, please.
Yeah, so I think in prehistory or in antiquity, human beings experienced their environment in terms of an all-pervading symbolic complex, which they attempted to embody in terms of certain icons or beings, like fetishes or implements. In other words, drawing down certain metaphysical principles or celestial intelligences. Even in terms of like agriculture. So we mentioned this before, but agriculture arose in the context of this primeval symbolic dyad between the masculine and the feminine principles within the process of birth, death, and potentially rebirth. So, so an implement like the sickle is really an embodiment of a certain feminine power, which is related to the moon. So the first sickles were actually constructed from the jawbones of ruminants, like cattle or oryx. And so these people were basically grazing with this jawbone over their environment, symbolically reciting or recapitulating processes that they were observing in the natural world. So,
and perhaps singing.
Yeah.
Singing.
Right?
Not speaking, singing. Right. While they're doing this.
Right. So again, this kind of symbol, I think, was bound up with the genesis of language in certain respects. Yeah.
Holding the moon, symbolically, using the moon, which we could understand. Okay, there's so much here, and I don't want to get lost, but I'm just going to mention that in one of the Blackfoot creation stories, the moon, the sun and the moon come to the earth and they are married here. Sort of, they have a Hogan. This is their Hogan, and they have 7 children, all boys. And the sun and the children hunt by day, and the moon takes a lover. And in Blackfoot culture, the sun has a very adept sense of smell. This is the fundamental thing about the sun; it smells things. And the lover is described as what I would call a prodigy in the sense of a primeval mystery. A many-legged snake, this is an English translation, a many-legged snake that lives in a hollow log, and it has a scent. The sun can smell it. Now I've speculated that this could perhaps be bees, right? Because a many-legged snake. It's also clear that they're going to burn it, the sun, once they realize that the moon's like stepping out on the sun's going to kill the sun, and the children are going to kill her lover. And they have to burn it, and they have to be very careful not to let a cinder get away. A cinder, which, by the way, if you've ever been stung, it feels like a cinder, right? You can be like, "Oh, is something burning me?" Right? Especially if it's a hornet. The sun can smell the lover on her, which I suppose could possibly be the smell of honey, right? And also, what could be more appropriate? The beehive is literally a matriarchal society, right? It's the feminine intelligence that orchestrates and concentrates the intelligences of the entire vegetal world and connects them all, right? And then produces this incredible, amazing substance called honey, right? And which is delicious and everyone wants some, and the bees produce far more than they could ever use. So it's obvious that this is a symbol of catastrophic abundance, right? Of so much abundance that it could not be used up, right? Like an infinite abundance, which is also very feminine. Now, what happens is when the moon discovers that they've killed her lover, she goes insane and becomes a sort of banshee-like presence, hunting them through the world. And they are running away. And the sun gives 7 pouches. 7 is probably very important, but that's the number of the children. This may, in fact, relate to the Pleiades or the Dipper stars, right? The 7 number, but also possibly the planets, or maybe all 3, and something else we don't know about. He gives them each a sort of a little pouch, and there are various different things in the pouch. One is a stick. If you throw it down, it becomes a vast forest that's impenetrable. Another one's a rock. If you throw it down, it becomes mountains that you can't get across. And there's various impediments that are given to the boys to try to impede the pursuing banshee moon mother, right? And here's where things get interesting, I think. Well, the whole thing is fascinating to me and important because it's way older than the stories we're usually given. I suspect 10 to 30,000 years old, so compared to stuff we usually hear, way older. So what happens is the moon eventually catches up to them, and the sun cuts off her leg. And when he does that, this somehow resolves the pursuit and the combat, and they all end up in the sky. And what the moon is doing as she's going through the phases is she's regrowing and losing the leg over and over again in a cycle, right?
Yeah.
So this crescent, right, is literally like the cut or the cutting.
Yeah.
Please continue.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense. That's fascinating. I never knew that. So. Yeah, so the sickle is, of course, a crescent shape.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the sickle was really emblematic of death, just like the scythe, right,
Mm-hmm.
with the Grim Reaper.
Right, yeah.
So,
by the way, that's masculine plus feminine, right? You have the feminine arc with the masculine rod, and the
right.
combination of those kills.
Yeah.
Is power.
I wanted to mention as you were speaking too that, I think the Greek language contains 7 vowels because of the 7 planetary zones.
Right, yeah.
So,
also the vowel, this is the spirit sound. These are the sounds of flow, right? Whereas the consonants are sounds of structure.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting also that in Hebrew the vowels are missing, right? They had to be supplied by a living mind, and were not written until the Masoretics started producing the markings to indicate which vowels. But think carefully about how profound it is to have a language where the vowels have to be supplied by a living mind, because now you have the structure, you have the dead part of the language, which are the consonants or whatever you want to call those, and they have to be completed by a living mind. They never have the whole dead thing written out. Mm-hmm. And when you have to complete it by a living mind, surely, as you're looking at the word, you're thinking of some of the alternatives, right? What if I put different vowels here? You're having a much more creative and connotative and symbolic relationship with the formulation of the words, the reading of the words, because if you're writing them, you're going to be doing the same thing. You're going to be thinking like, wow, what if they think it means this? Oh, what if it did mean that? Right? And then, so you're really going to have a much richer manifold, sort of a cloud structure, a possibility space around the word that is profoundly different from what we have, where the spelling is given for every word, always.
Yeah, but I think that was how language originally functioned. In other words, language was originally a kind of vehicle whereby you could remember certain connections within the cosmos between various phenomena. So these symbols were bound together with that process of recollection.
Wow. Yes, anamnesis, right? Or even active rememorying, right? Like new memorying, right? The revision, the recollection, the revision, the revivification, the resurrection, all of these things. And, spelling. I mean, what are we kidding? Like, literally, are you feel like, oh, that's an accident? No, that's not accidental. The idea of casting a spell and of spelling are intimately interwoven in the origins of the possibilities of writing, which were, in some cases, detested by certain philosophers, Socrates among them. Right. Also, if Jesus existed, never wrote anything. Many other mythic figures and messianic figures wrote nothing that we know of ever. Of course, we don't know whether they wrote or not, but...
Yeah. So you can see how technology is anathema to memory in a certain sense, because the originally symbolic gesture that was wedded to this object needed to be eclipsed for it to acquire what we call use or utility.
Wow. So, okay, say that again and say more about that. Articulate that further, please. That's powerful.
Yeah, so over the course of the development of our language, as with the development of our technology, we lose these originally cosmogonic connections within the symbols that I think were originally perceived in our environment. And they become these deadened structures, whether technical objects or written language.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm.
Or generalizations within contemporary language,
mm-hmm.
which are these after images of original symbols. So So in other words, the symbol functions by moving from the one to the many, whereas the process of generalization in our language moves from the many to the one. So we think that concepts encompass what different objects have in common. So we think of, like, in Platonism, the everyday reading of Platonism is that the form of the chair is that which every chair somehow has in common. But that generalization, I think, is mistaken. What I think Plato meant was something more like a symbol, which is present in our environment.
Wow, okay.
Even in the Goethean sense.
Sure.
Yeah, so.
Sure.
Yeah. Like what Goethe was observing in the metamorphosis of a living organism was the presence of this unity, something symbolic, that assumed a manifold guise. So.
Okay, so it's a.
It was originally a percept. It was something that you could see with your anatomy. It was present within your waking vision. Yeah, symbols weren't abstractions; they were percepts.
So then it would be as if there's a.
Yeah, language was originally a perceptive vehicle. It was supposed to facilitate certain images.
It still does, to a degree.
Yeah.
It's very degraded, I think. So the animal, let us say for example, the salamander, is an exemplar of something meta to the salamander itself. Yes?
Yeah.
Which the salamander is acting out, embodying, bringing to life, informing, right? And so, but where then, because certainly I don't think you suspect that the concept of the place where the Platonic forms exist is real. I don't think you think that way at all. Where does the metaform that the salamander is being, where is that thing?
I think at least in part it belongs to the past. Yeah, so I think it indwells the flow of time.
Oh wow, okay, that's beautiful. It indwells the flow of time.
Yeah, so an organism, I think, is the reappearance of something that really belongs to the past. So a portion of the past reappears as a whole unit. So the same process, I think, takes place within our perception. So that was why I was espousing direct realism some time ago. Yeah.
Say more about direct realism. Give us a little sketch, a walnut shell version, and so we can understand what you mean by this phrase.
Yeah, so I mean, direct realism is fairly straightforward. Direct realism is simply the idea that when you perceive your environment, there are two, fundamental beings, you and your environment, right? As opposed to some third medium. So modern science tends to approach the act of perception in the fashion of like indirect realism. So the idea that some mediating process separates your perception from the physical world. Direct realism would be the idea that there is no third term, there is no third entity that separates me or cleaves me from the world. So it's more participatory.
I mean, that's fascinating and confusing, because it seems to me, from my experience of language and concepts, that they almost form the third medium that actually divides me in my mind from you and the world and my experience and all these things, and produces this overlay or underlay or interlay of abstractions and what would I call them? Figures of identity and so forth, which are certainly confused, possibly lethal, in the sense of the causal of forgetting, right? but I can see how that's not necessarily the third thing. I can, imagine that that's not necessarily a third thing.
Yeah, right.
I mean, there's so much here to explore. So when you said something that resembles that which is expressed as the salamander indwells in the past in the flow of time.
Yeah.
Say more. Help us understand what it's like to indwell in the flow of time.
Yeah, so what I think takes place in the development of a living system is the redintegration or the recovery or the reappearance of some portion of the past as a whole. So what was once something like a part reappears as something like a whole. So I think in terms of these part-whole relationships within what we call the flow of time, because I regard the flow of time as an indivisible motion. So I think that sort of like a wave-like structure.
So could one imagine, would it be mistaken in your view or confused to imagine, just for the sake of visualization, the flow of time is something resembling a tube in which there are strands that elaborate and reemerge? I think you're going to say no, but say whatever you're going to say.
Tubes, yeah.
I'm just trying to visualize something, and I know it's not going to work well, right? I'm expecting to fail. But like a tunnel, a complex array of tunnels and intersecting tubes, one of which becomes salamanders in the future, presuming linearity and all of that. Except we both know that. I think we both at least strongly suspect, if it's not true that we know, that whatever time is doing, it's not a linear set of do.
Right.
It's doing something very crazy where it's like expanding to both the beginning of the past and the end of the future, and then coming back to the moment, and then being expressed in the moment somehow, and then transforming both the past and the future when it expands again, and something like that. I have no idea how to conceptualize it. Maybe you could help me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my perception of this environment, I might claim is an integral whole. So my very perception of my surroundings itself is a kind of whole unit that contains certain ratios or harmonies that themselves reflect these broader cosmic wholes. So in other words, in the same way that my perception of my environment is an integral whole wholes appear as objects within my perception, whether it's organisms or certain physical phenomena.
Books.
Right.
Books kind of support the idea, right? Because they weren't written now. The author is not here, right? So the past is reemerging in the present and is represenced as the book, in a way.
Yeah, so I basically, reject the idea that time could be divided into qualitatively homogeneous segments. So once you reject the idea that time can be partitioned into, like immobile
slices. Little boxes.
At least I come to the conclusion that what manifests is always reflective of the past. So the past never ceases to exist. The past is something that perpetually streams into the present. So in a certain sense, you might say that I only ever perceive something which is already past. I think that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, but what appears as the present is really just a portion of the past that instantiates itself as a whole. So it works like memory.
I don't think that all makes sense to me, but I don't think you actually mean the word portion, do you? Do you?
No.
Right. Yeah. I just wanted to make sure, because that's
just a.
You mean a feature or something?
Yeah.
A characteristic or a complex of relational, situational, structural elements
Right.
that recur.
Yeah.
Please continue.
So in the body of a plant, for example, a stem leaf itself is the reappearance of something that indwells the past, which might look radically unlike what I think a stem leaf looks like. But then as you progress from the stem leaf to the sepal, you can see how the stem leaf undergoes a certain logical transformation, which provides the foundation for the petal. So
do you mean a logical transformation or a structural re-expression?
I see it as a logical process.
A logical process? Yeah. Can you say more about...
Like language, I mean, yeah.
Sure, same, okay. Help me understand what you mean by it being a logical process. What does the word logical mean for you in that description? I'm not trying to put you on the spot, just help me to see.
It means something like rational. So like in the Pythagorean sense of ratio, yeah. So the logos as a partitioning or rational principle is what I mean.
To relationally partition in such a fashion as to conserve and elaborate features of both elements in the ratio?
Yeah, so the appearance of any phenomenon presupposes that in which it stands in a relation.
In relation, yes.
So it only ever exists as a relation, which is, I think, somewhat similar to process philosophy. You know? But by that I mean something like ratio or logic. Yeah.
A structured relation between aspects or elements.
Yes. Yeah.
Don't let me put words in your mouth. By all means, correct me if I get it wrong.
The spatiality of a stem leaf reflects the spatiality of its concomitant neighbors, basically. So the spatial juxtaposition of the parts of the body of a flower is an integral whole. So the extent to which a stem leaf appears in space ultimately reflects the spatiality of other components. So by that I mean something. That's what I mean by logical. So you can perform arithmetic by looking at certain portions of its body, in the same way that you can perform arithmetic by analyzing light. I think it's quite homologous. Right?
That's a very dangerous thing to say, I think.
Well, that's how I think. That's how I think arithmetic was originally done.
I know, but
it wasn't.
Yeah.
It wasn't a graphical process.
I know your mind is like a thing from another universe, and fascinating and informative to behold. But I mean, some of the perspectives you have are unlike anything I've encountered, anything even resembling. And I've seen some, unusual transformations of intelligence and insight and perspective and concern.
Yeah, Plato didn't believe in writing anything. I mean, that's not what Plato meant by geometry.
Right.
By geometry, Plato meant something within optics. He was talking about something within light itself.
Really? Say more.
Yeah.
I mean, don't leave us there.
Sure.
Yeah. That's just, you let the ramp to the ship down. Now let's go up and board the ship, please.
Sure. So, I mean, for the ancient Greeks, geometry appears to have been a general theory of perception that was wedded to extramissionism, or the idea that the eye emits light, which now we think is somewhat dubious. We think, we're enlightened, but no, I mean, yeah, I mean,
that's very punny of you. Please continue. Enlightened.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I've heard you say very astonishing things like that relate to. Okay, so first of all, let's be very clear about something. Whether or not we can determine whether or not the eyes emit light, it seems that we can determine that beings are sensitive to observation, even when they cannot see that they are being observed, observation from behind, and so forth. And so, whether or not the eyes actually emit photons or something, light waves, it seems clear that the ancient Greek, and probably they were not the only people to make this discovery, we just happen to know about them because they were writing a lot and they left records. But it seems very clear that the gaze that are seeing can have a broad array of different characters, and it is as if it is touching or caressing or penetrating or tapping on things that we see.
Yes.
They are affected by being seen. We are affected by seeing, they are affected by being seen. And so the one reasonable metaphor is the metaphor of touching, right? Our seeing touches, in a sense.
That was how the ancient atomists thought of vision.
Yes.
And perhaps Plato himself. Yeah.
Yes. And you had said something I found very fascinating about the possibility that ancient people creating the things that we understand as cave paintings might have been relating with something like feedback. Please continue, elucidate.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I can tell, Plato was simply transmitting or perpetuating a much more ancient spiritual discipline that potentially I think you can find in Paleolithic cave art. Yeah, so so what Plato meant by geometry involved something like becoming conscious of the extent to which your eyes emit light. So that process of becoming conscious was, I think, originally wedded to the acquisition of self-knowledge, because phosphenes essentially reveal three-dimensional projections of your own brain activity. So by meditating on phosphenes, as far as I can tell, Plato was attempting to transmit this esoteric discipline whereby you could acquire information about your own essence or your own anatomy at the very least.
Origin, nature, purposive, aura. I don't know what the right word is. Purposive. Nature is one thing I can say. But it's not just Plato, right?
No,
not by a long shot.
No.
Right. So let's be clear. Humans have been aware of this long. Plato inherited this knowledge. I mean, he may have had some relatively novel and or personal and or unique insight, but he had many teachers, we must imagine, among them some extremely brilliant minds, and also, although he has not spoken yet at length about it, and it's something I hope to ask him about, Amon Hillman has talked about this Greek concept ops, from which I think we get ophthalmology and things, which is the power of the gaze and the eye to transfix, to caress, to transform, to capture, to instruct. All of these things, these are active powers of the gaze. They're not receptive, right?
Yes.
They're magical powers of the gaze, that he refers to with this three-letter root, ops. I think it's ops, not ops. And clearly he is aware and utilizes some feature of this in his own relationships with people.
Sure, yeah. No, I mean, the connection between geometry and megalithic constructions obviously preceded Plato. So
right. And the cave paintings by, tens of thousands, 50,000 years, who knows what,
yeah.
Some cave work.
So my suspicion is that these megalithic constructions were transplantations of the environment of the cave to the surface in order to bridge this gap between this acoustic theory and this optical theory. So there was this kind of process whereby the cave was moved to the surface in order for the cave to interact with stellar light or with sunlight.
And sound.
And sound, yeah.
Right. Okay,
so even for the Pythagoreans, acoustics was, I think, originally wedded to geometry and so on.
Yeah, as it is for us in theory, particularly the aspects of physics that have to do with sound and frequency and so forth. Okay, let's see. Okay, so again, we find in the cave the reiteration of the principle of the womb, right? The power of the womb as encompassing, protective, primordial, magical, metaphysical. Both you have birth, you have like conception, right? Birth, life, death, and resurrection, all happening in this feminine cavity, right? This cathonically feminine cavity in this case, right? Which perhaps they imagined space to be the super. Help me out.
Yeah. Well, descending into the cave is analogous to rising into outer space.
Right.
So those two seemingly contrary motions are really one and the same.
Mm-hmm.
So by descending into the cave, you're really becoming an astronaut. Yeah.
So amazingly brilliant. Because it should have been obvious. I don't think it is obvious to moderns. It was certainly obvious to Ingo Swann that you didn't need a spaceship to travel in space, right? Because he went and looked at least in his book Penetration, he discusses getting the idea to remote view Jupiter, which was laughed at by the project people until he threatened to leave, and they were like, okay, go ahead, try this. And then, as is claimed in his book anyway, many of the reports that he made about certain features of Jupiter, about 15 in a row, all of them were later validated by the observations of the Voyager probe, which was then en route or close to Jupiter. And was some of the remote observations he made were validated much later by other means, according to him. But yeah, the universe would be a sad and tragic place if indeed to travel in it required machines. So would so too our relationships are destroyed. Now, not only destroyed, right? Like you and I met via the aegis of machines, but it's a sad and tragic situation when our relational interactions are reduced to those that can only be carried by machines, right? Because the richness of in meet space presence is very profound. Number one. Number two, the kinds of intimacies that arise, prosper, are mutually curated and nurtured as two people who adore each other are pulled apart over a distance. Rumi and his lover, for example. What was his name? I can't remember. Naps. What was his name? I can't remember what he called his lover, or that man's name. But I myself have experienced very transcendental modes of intimacy due to the imposition of distance and without the imposition of machines, right? Yeah. So, the mother who senses that her son is in trouble just before he calls her, right? And tells her husband, something's wrong. Where is Thomas? And then she finds out that indeed there's some problem, hopefully a resolvable one. Yes, the intimacies. Okay, this is a whole other topic, which is that humans seem to suppose that distance equals separation, when in many cases there are many forms of distance and modes of relation over distance, where greater distance equals greater intimacy, not lesser intimacy as we suppose. And this brings us back to something that I just want to tap on briefly from this morning when we were talking. We were looking at a very elaborate stone on the ground that's quite beautiful and probably worth absolutely nothing. I mean, as a piece of garden sculpture, it might be worth some money because it's huge and colorful and hard to transport. But we are trained to only value those things that are culturally or commercially valued by humans, so that if I were to find a large diamond, I would get very excited. If I were to find a chunk of gold, I would get very excited. But if we had actual intelligent insight and that was active in our minds, then we would understand, we would be imbued, I think, with an originary, active sense of real value that is not based on representations or commodities, but is based on some sort of participatory sensing and intimacy with the environment, history, the future, the people, the organisms, the sky, right? All of these things would combine to produce a kind of a system of value that we could actually trust, because it's not based on abstractions or bullshit or lies or fictions or authorities or war or commerce or money or, you know, whatever kind of trafficking in occlusion that has become dominant and popular around here. So anything you wish to add? Or
yeah, I mean, our idea of measurement, I think, is flawed.
Yeah, that'd be putting it mildly.
Yeah.
And certainly the measurement of like value, what's important.
Right.
Not only do we get that wrong a lot, we're getting it wrong as a species in such a way that could put an end to the history and future of this world.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty big mistake. You can't make a bigger mistake. You can you can put an end to the entire history and meaning of measurement right now, right?
Yes.
Just put an end to it, right? There's no more of that around here ever again.
Yeah.
If you make, the wrong kinds of moves, the wrong kinds of measurements, your values are skewed enough that they get everybody killed.
Yes, right. One of our presuppositions, I think, is that space is easily computable. We can easily subordinate space to some kind of common metric.
No, like distance.
Right, so we can superimpose graph paper upon our perception of space in some, easy fashion. Yeah, I totally reject that paradigm. So.
Okay, so it's interesting when you say things like that, because what I hear is a kind of a moral, emotional, aesthetic, and intellectual revulsion, right? Like, this is disgusting. Why are you people doing that wrong thing, right? And that's very profound.
I think it is moral. I think,
but it's also it's intellectually aesthetic and philosophically aesthetic. You know it's wrong. You fundamentally sense like this is a bad thing.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm capable of similar concerns and insights, but I usually admit I have a little special box in which I keep the things that I'm going to call this little box the things the humans do. Right? I have this little box, and I recognize that the humans do these things, and I validate them to the degree that the humans do them, and they make machines with them and things. But I don't hold them as fundamentally authoritative. And I do disagree with a lot of the purposes for which humans do like humans qua the species or the collective, monstrous collectives of corporations, the military-industrial complex, governments, whatever. You just name the monsters, and they're doing insane things with the findings of science and measurement. Mm-hmm. Right. But yeah, please continue about the problem with measurement and the grid, the three-dimensional graph paper that they put everywhere, and it was like, oh yeah, well there's a planet here, so the graph paper bends, and that causes the light to bend, right, and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, our fixation on graph paper is really just bound up with our fixation on perimeterizing phenomena, controlling phenomena.
The rectangles.
Domesticating phenomena.
Yeah, the rectangles.
Yeah.
Like it's like swarming, rectangles. The bookshelves, the books, the carpet, the bed, the door, the windows, the squares in the windows, the camera we're filming this on, the video that will be produced by is all, bounded with angles.
Yeah, this kind of neurotic fixation on control and predictability.
Grasping.
Yes. Underpins our whole concept of science and therefore scientific knowledge. So.
Also ownership, which is the weirdest idea. One of the things I find hilarious is when I hear commentators saying things like, those UFOs are invading our airspace. And I'm like, wait a minute, our airspace? I understand that concept in relation to like China, right? If China was to overfly our airspace or something, but UFOs? Like, what are people thinking? Like, we own space, we own chunks of space-time, that we have a right to, get really angry if anything goes through there. Like birds are invading our airspace. We should just shoot those down. We're not in control of those birds.
Yeah.
We do shoot them down. We burn them down with wires conducting electricity for our machines and things by the millions per hour or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, I read an article earlier. Birds are starting wildfires by being caught on fire by electrical wires and just flaming out. And I mean, those damn birds, why do they keep starting those fires that way?
Right. No, space I think is fundamentally anisotropic. So as opposed to regarding space as a uniform medium like a container, which would be totally neutral with respect to movement or how it might be populated by objects, I regard space as more of a plural phenomenon. So as opposed to regarding space as a monolithic container, space I think actually changes as you progress through it or move through it.
I mean, I would go much further and say that all the natural phenomena that we observe here on Earth, that we participate with, actually, let me put that a different way, and that we ourselves are formed in, with, and from, these are expressions of the nature, character, origin, temperament, and perhaps even purposive spirit of time-space.
Yeah, right.
Like,
precisely.
And so, if there are other worlds in time-space, naturally, we probably differ in this. I do sort of conceive of it as a container, okay? So that I imagine that if very distantly there's another star or another planet with life forms on it, right? It would be impossible for this planet to be entirely separate from that one. These two planets would be exchanging what I might think of as they'd be in a kind of a conversation that would inform the structure, character, activity, and behavior of the organisms. So that in a sense, in the same way, every island in the ocean is unique, right? Yet they are all islands in the ocean. And so, although you may find unique life forms on different islands, you find you find expressions of the same fundamental lexicon, so to speak, of life, right? And so I like to think, and in fact I feel it's very likely that this is so, but perhaps you could just call that a bias or belief, that all of the forms we see here are indicative of the nature of time-space and life on other worlds. In other words, everything you can find in time-space, you can find right here, right?
Yeah, I agree with that.
It's not just some little floating speck in a vast morass of emptiness and fucking weirdness and nebulae and stuff that have nothing to do with us, right? We're the important thing. That stuff out there is just all unknown.
Yeah.
That's a bizarre idea. If the ancients, if they conceived of, I'm fascinatedly curious to understand what it was like to walk out under the living sky 50,000 years ago as a human and just look up and what did they participatorily perceive there, because it certainly wasn't anything like what we are mostly I think we're just living in a catastrophic deprivation that's conceptual and bizarre, mind-breaking, occlusive, heart-breaking. But yeah, I've been blabbering on long enough.
Oh, no, it makes sense. The actual goal of science, I think, is to uncover the unit of measurement that ought to be used in order to fully comprehend a being or a phenomenon. So implicit in the appearance of a being or a phenomenon is the unit of measurement that ought to be used to render it intelligible.
Wow.
So by applying this external, qualitatively homogeneous unit, we actually eclipse or occlude or conceal something which is truly essential, which would be the actual object of scientific investigation. Like
Okay.
That's what I guess.
Yes, beautiful. I think that might be confusing to some listeners, because when you say say the unit of measurement,
Yeah.
they're going to think you mean something like a number, and you don't.
I mean something like what I was calling form.
Yeah.
So the form is the actual unit
Yeah.
of measurement.
And maybe even
Yeah.
the symbol.
Yes, that's exactly
right. Okay. So this, I think it's very difficult to move into the condominium of your mind. It's a ridiculous metaphor there, but the spatialization of your thought instantaneously. But I'm dragging myself slowly in that direction. And I just want to ask you straight up, which may be a little bit of a cheating question here. Do you suppose perhaps that John Dee's that symbol has anything to do with this topic?
I think so.
Say more.
I mean, I can only speak from my intuition.
Of course.
But from what I can gather, John Dee was trying to elaborate a certain kind of cosmogony whereby light descends into matter, which I can understand in my own sense.
Not hard for me to grasp that.
Yeah, so I mean that's still sort of...
Also, Arthur Young in his Reflexive Universe proposes a very similar idea. Guy who solved the mechanical problems resulting in usable helicopters, which are sort of a nightmare on Earth, but nonetheless a very significant engineering problem. Yeah, please continue.
I mean, just the relationship between light and matter is something that preoccupies me. So that's why I find John Dee of interest, because he was really a scholar of ancient Greek geometry and the Greek language. So I think he probably has some insight.
This book that you recently acquired, what sparked? I understand that there's a historical thread here that leads you to seek this book and to become excited about finding it. But talk about the book a little bit and your interest in it and what you have come to understand about it.
The Monas Hieroglyphica.
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean the Monas Hieroglyphica is simply a book that explains a symbol that John Dee constructed, which appears to have been bound up with the history of Rosicrucianism. So I think it recurs within the Rosicrucian manifestos. So my interest in Rosicrucianism is, just generally related to my interest in the history of science and mechanical philosophy. People like Francis Bacon or John Locke, right? Because from my perspective, modern science actually arose in the context of attempting to communicate with angels. And if you actually look at the history of, why people like Leibniz were interested in developing theories of computation, or why John Locke introduced this distinction between primary qualities and secondary qualities in his theory of knowledge, it was related to recovering the Adamic language. So it was related to communicating with angels, basically. So the reason that we have computers here today is really downstream from those Rosicrucian developments. So that's my interest.
Say something about what you imagine the Adamic language to be.
So
what does this phrase mean for you? How do you think about it?
So when I think about, the Adamic language, I think about what underpins this connection that I mentioned between mythology, technology, and sound symbolism. Because if you look at the Kabbalah, at least I see traces of sound symbolism in the idea of using speech to influence material creation, like the golem, for example. So the creation of the golem in the Kabbalah was really connected to certain kinds of enunciations, which themselves were connected to drawing down astral influences from like celestial spheres, which you can find corollaries to in Greek philosophy, I think. So
yes,
as I was sort of mentioning.
Also, incantation.
Yes.
Invocation. Evocation. And vastly older things like the Icaros of the South American indigenous people and the probably should be called something other than songs, but the songs of ancient indigenous peoples and even modern indigenous peoples. There are songs that are still enacted, and these songs always accompany the activation, not the direction of forces and powers that are not human, right? And it's very interesting. In Atsamoitskan, which is the morning speaking to the beings and the world and history and the future is my way of saying it. I'll take responsibility for that. It's the morning, what we would think of as a ceremony, a cleansing prayer, something like this. In Atsamoitskan, one does not request things. One speaks them into factual existence. Right? There's no like, please help me. There's nothing like that. It's not commandment either, right? If we were to describe it, we would say you command the da-da-da. In English, you might say that, but that's not. I don't think that's what it is. And also, the songs, they do the thing you're talking about in time. They draw the past into this moment and remake it here now, changing this moment and the past and the future by this process of relational intimacy, acknowledgement, recollection, anamnesis, active. All these things active together in this sort of manifold, right? That restructures the meaning and identity and relationships in this moment. And we have this word magic, which is a very strange idea compared to what I think our distant ancestors knew, experienced, and were up to. They weren't casting spells in the way that we think about it at all. I don't even know what this casting idea comes from. Are we fishing or something? But yeah, so these are some of the things that I think of. And also, it's very important that in many old and still existing cultures, there's these features that we would call initiation. But then in Blackfoot, for example, and I don't have any rights to speak about Blackfoot, just to be clear. I'm talking about something that I've become aware of through the auspices of my friend Ryan Firstdiver. But there's something called transfer, which changes a person, introduces and connects them with that stream in time, and transforms their interiority and I think it was their spirit or something. Something new arises in them. They become participatory in this long stream, so to speak. And literally, my experience anyway, is that undergoing that process of transfer, even a simple transfer, what happens is the beings along the whole timeline come to you and check you out, right? They're like, so this guy's joining our family. Okay, let's see what's going on with this guy. In a vast ceremonial thing that is inexplicably profound and beautiful, and alive in a way that it's very difficult for us to understand as moderns. A living way, right? Of, I don't even know, active and amnoetic momenta.
Right.
Something like this.
Yeah. I think language was originally that very process of recollecting. To recollect as you enunciate.
Yes.
That's,
Yes, very different, because, obviously what Aristotle, I think, was upset about. Was it Aristotle? Maybe it was Socrates, I can't remember. One of them was complaining fiercely about writing. And the complaint was something like, you're going to have people walking around with no experience of something. They're going to be talking about it as if they're masters of it. There was no transfer of knowledge from one human, from one being to another. The process of transfer, gone. Now they just have a scroll that they read, and then they ape mastery and expertise and intimacy and so on. And of course, this is in the context where you have like the rhapsodes, right, who can come along and just directly manipulate your emotions on purpose, some beautifully, but some nefariously too. And then you have the sophists, which are even scarier, right? These are people who just manipulate the features of rhetoric and language in such a way as to entrap or directly control or enchant or blind or successfully weave fictions for the sake of power or money or law or whatever. The masters of the rhetorical catalog, right? Artful with speech, but uncaring about truth or virtue or relational integrity, right? Just using the language, whatever you have.
Yeah,
Give me
I mean,
whatever you have.
sophistry is about winning.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Right, winning. Okay.
Which is about war.
Yes, and also domination, and you can always invent a better weapon, right? You can just keep inventing a more powerful weapon once that's your goal.
Yeah, you can almost see though where writing originated in these caves. So.
Yes. Repetitions of form, tropes of form, perhaps in light and shadow.
Yeah,
right?
So essentially as the master marks his phosphenes or her phosphenes upon the wall, his or her student can absorb some of their power.
Oh wow, yeah.
Much like a mandala, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the master through meditation projects an image of his own brain activity, which he might observe, but which his student can also absorb. So this kind of transmission, I think, was really at the basis of perhaps writing.
Wow.
So in other words, they were reading each other like a mind meld. It was some kind of like transmission of.
Yeah, these images were catalytic in that relationship, right? They were powerful, charged. They drew the minds together in a sense, in a kind of visual agreement. The master projects. Okay, so let's be really clear, because we didn't say this earlier. Master is having phosphenic imagery inside the cave, then records that imagery
simply marks it.
Okay, and then others come and they receive that imagery, and it's imbued with power that transforms. It's not just they see things; they're not just looking at like the way we do, right?
Yeah.
They're having a non-ordinary experience of the imposition of these images into some feature of their consciousness that we may not even have, right? We may have been born bereft of this feature of mind,
right,
and probably are, because the ancients were having experiences of consciousness we don't have. I'm certain of this. And it wasn't just because they're making shit up, right? They're not just like, oh, they're superstitious. Right? You can imagine, I think there was even a show about this. You can imagine in the future people are born blind and no one has any eyes. And they read all this stuff about seeing and stuff, and they're like, those people are just there's no such thing as seeing. What are they talking about? And then somebody's born that can see and and they kill them, and because everything around their culture, I think there was a show similar to this, but you can imagine the trope without the show, right?
Yeah.
And I think we are like that in terms of certainly our capacity to participate in relation and experience, and our capacity to, we're really good at abstract concepts, making little maps and shit, cutting things apart, putting them back together in other forms.
Yeah.
But that's a tragic impoverishment compared to immediate relational intimacy, like mind sharing, not just telepathy, but the mutual formation of mental space that we can both play and develop in this kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
The cave paintings, yes. Oh yeah, so the theriomorphs, right?
Mm-hmm.
These are not necessarily, okay, yeah, say whatever you want to talk about the theriomorphs.
I want to hear your perspective.
Well, one imagines that if you're having phosphenes, okay, so the other night, a couple nights ago, I had a dream that I talked to you about, right? Where I met this woman, and what she did was she explained, she was a sort of a counselor, therapist type, very intuitively brilliant, and she would help people find their animals, and they were stored in their back, right? The animals were stored in their back.
Yeah.
And wow, so it's so trippy. When you turn your head up slightly, the blue window appears in both of your.
Oh, okay.
Oh yeah, man, that's nuts. Yeah, that's just crazy. Brilliant. Because it's sort of like what we're talking about, right? Like there's a reflection on this pane, and it's making me feel something very different about what sort of a being is in front of me when I see that reflection in the pane of the glasses. All right, so we were speaking earlier, and I said to you that the vision that Toymaker made my mind to see of not just time-space, but that which is from which time-space arises, as a sort of a flowing, intelligent fluid reflection of this origin space, right? I'll call it origin, which is outside of time. That the universe is basically a universe city, and also a university, and also a living library where the books read themselves to you. And this is what has happened to me. I've had this experience like with the wasp, right? When it dumped what I felt was the entire history of its people into my mind over the course of a few seconds. And I experienced that history as myself, right? I became that history. It wasn't like something was shown to me. It was like I unforgot the entire history of the wasps since their inception on this world as my own being. And so you can imagine ancients having this experience regularly and not thinking of themselves as humans at all. What would they think of themselves as? Something we can't imagine. And whatever we've been told to think of ourselves as is most certainly wrong and completely deprived of 98% of what we are, can be, we're meant to be, are for, and all these things. So I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit excited. But the catastrophic lying bullshit impoverishment of you're a human being and blah blah blah, you manipulate devices with your fingers, guns, buddy, and computers and stuff. What? I mean, you might as well just snip off all our limbs and tape them to the wall and then tell complex mechanical stories about. Help me out, please, I'm losing here. But I just want to, I'll finish up. So each of the beings and forms in the universe is both a unique array of forms of intelligence, memory, and relation. They are I'll go ahead and use the metaphor of living books, okay? But they're not books, because they're not records. They're transcendental to the concept of book in 50 different ways. But I'll go ahead and use that concept. And so one of the things I find fascinating about you is that you are doing the thing that the universe is being. You are like a living library, a universe city, which is also a university. And I think there's something truly noble about that, and beautiful and profound, enchanting, all of these things. And so that's a lot of why I think it's really important for us to make recordings like this, so that we can both have the opportunity to explore each other's thought and concern and perception, but also to read ourselves to the other beings. and to read each other into the other beings. And so what I think was happening is that the living world was reading itself into the ancients, and then they were enlightening the reading onto the cave walls, and then the people were receiving the enlightenment from the cave walls and being transformed and being ananoicized, right? Like being actively imbued with iterative waves of unforgetting that echoed and expanded over time like a heartbeat that's like beating in 9 new ways every time it beats. In their mind, in their spirit, in their heart, in their relationships with the sky, each other, the earth, a stone, the animal, the plants, the food, the shelter, the predators, all of this thing. Yeah. Something like this.
Yeah.
But we got lucky to be able to remember or see something even vaguely similar to what we managed here today, I think.
Yeah. I think so.
I feel lucky.
Oh, I know, yeah, for sure. I'm very lucky.
Would you like to pause here? Shall we continue? How are you feeling?
I feel fine.
Great.
Yeah, I could keep going, but
Let's keep going then.
Well, you can see in Paleolithic cave art certain relationships between animals, which I think is also highly significant. So like depictions of human beings tend to be wispy, they tend to be ephemeral, like ghosts, which I think is important to consider. But between France and Spain, the most common pairing of animals is that between the horse and the oryx or the bison, basically the ruminant, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which appears to have reflected this primeval dyad between the masculine and the feminine, that agriculture preserved in this roundabout way. So understanding that relationship, I think, is illuminating. Because animals themselves were seen as relations, not simply as, objects or beings in our everyday sense.
Absolutely. A long time ago now, there's certain transformations of lexicon that, okay, if you don't have them, they're crippling, right? And if you can recorrect certain root ideas in the lexicon, it ends up correcting a whole array of other ideas. So one of those root elements that I call holophores, everything vehicle, because there's like a ring of holophores, right? It's like world, animal, mother, friend, dream, food, all these things, right? And damage to any one of these is inherited by all the others. So as science and mechanism and reductionism, as it rips our lexicons to shreds and eviscerates connotative aspects of root concepts like world, person, mother, dream, food, friend, animal, tree, plant, water, ocean, all these things. If you damage one of those, the damage spreads around them. And similarly, if you repair any one of those, that repair is spread to all the others. They're linked together in a sort of superstructure that we can't see.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to stop lecturing about that in a second, but there's also this problem of what I call the super container, which is the thing from which each of the holophores descends. And then the lexicon is sort of inside the ring of the holophores. So damage to that damages every element in the lexicon. Repairs to those things repair every element in the lexicon. And one of the earliest repairs that I ever experienced, which might seem, a little bit trivial at first glance, but wildly isn't, is that the organisms are peoples, right? When I first realized, those are peoples, just like we are peoples. The whales are peoples, the bees are people, the mice, they are people, right? When I realized that, it changed everything I was capable of thinking, right? And this is how repairs to holophores work. This is a technology we can actually enact. It's not just some theory, right? You can do this. you can change what tree means. And that will change everything for you, in part because human language, knowledge, measurement, science, all these things, they're based on a tree structure, right? So if you change what a tree means, you change the mapping structure you're using to orient yourself in language and conceptual space.
Yeah.
And one of the simplest transformations of tree that happened for me, and this was in my mid to late 20s, I started trying to understand, what are trees doing? What are they doing? What are they being? And so I started asking the trees, and eventually it just emerged in my mind that they were like drawing down the energies and intelligences of the sky, integrating and transforming them, transmitting them into the earth, drawing all the intelligences and transformations of the earth up into themselves, transmitting them into the sky, right? This sort of, bridging the two worlds, without which you got nothing. You got nothing, right? And so I realized, they are beings, they are people, they are living antenna, they are in touch with all of the intelligences, they integrate them, they transform them, they transmit them, they gather them together, they transform them, they transmit them. And then once you have this idea, you can sort of do the same. I mean, you're not that different yourself, okay? I'll just show you something kind of weird about yourself for a moment. You have these things we call feet, right? And mostly, you keep them in darkness, don't you? Mm-hmm. They're not just exposed to the light all the time, at least not around here. And, that's for protecting your feet from damage and things like that, especially in a technological space. But notice we kind of keep them dark as if they were underground, right? Then we have this other thing, which we reach up to the sky, right, with our hands open, and we call something into ourselves, and we transform it. We eat the food, we transform it. The trees don't eat the light, but they transform the light. Right. So there are all these things, and these are transformations of holophores that I can easily demonstrate. There's lots of others. What is a dream? What is a friend? Your mother? All these things, right? Where you can repair the lost associations and connotations so that the complexity of the definition is fundamentally transformed in your consciousness in a way that's very unlikely to ever be undone, right? And that is a kind of a healing of the linguistic, semantic, and psycho-linguistic features of our relationship with language and concepts that I think is crucially important. It's something I believe very deeply in. But yeah, the animals are peoples. And so one of the ways to think of the humans, it's not the only way, but I like it, is we are the animal that can become the summation lens for all the other beings. And this isn't because we're made special or because we are the dominant or best thing. What it is a sort of a gift, right? That is the privilege or inheritance of the entire biosphere lifting us up to this position to become perhaps its avatar and representative. And I think the ancients were aware of this and honored it and felt like humble and emotionally profound about this gift and protected it and treasured it and knew it was precious and wouldn't give it up, would rather die than give up their felt sense of God, what's the word? Of this I can't find the word, my vocabulary is failing. This transmission, right? This gift, this privilege, this thing they must fulfill. I can't find the word. And so this is part of what the theriomorphs were about, right? Yeah. We are all the people. We are the all people.
Right.
And maybe similarly, they are the all people too, right? They are the animal like we are the theriomorphs, and they are the morio ants, right, or something like this.
Yeah, I suspect as much.
Yeah, because I've heard there's a Blackfoot story where in a certain critical situation, one of the sort of heroes, I keep using the word sort of, I'll stop that. One of the heroes is taken to the city of the animal people. And this is the place where the animals, they are theriomorphs. They are like humans with animal faces and heads and things. And they are people. And there's something that the person is never supposed to do, that they are warned. It's something like, don't accept a gift. Don't accept a gift. And they're going to try to give you presents. You mustn't accept the presents when you're there, right? You can't accept them there. You can accept them outside if they give you presents or something like this, which is very important because the animals give us gifts. They make offerings to us, and we can do something similar for them. But yeah, so what are your thoughts about the theriomorphs and the images that we see? Obviously, many of the images in the cave paintings have to do with moons, like counting moon cycles. They have to do with transformation of weather over moons, transformation of perhaps food sources and or animals over the moons. They have to do with moons and transformations of things in the sky over the moons. And often those are circular things or even spiraling things. Because I've seen, I'm not trying to say all of these things are this, but this is not uncommonly seen in cave paintings.
Right. Well, I mean, I personally suspect that the horse was regarded as an embodiment of the sky or of the wind, whereas the ruminant, like the bison, was regarded as an embodiment of the earth. So there was this kind of interplay, which you can see even in their so-called symbols. So there are 32 symbols that are found throughout caves between France and Spain. Those symbols have been investigated by a number of people, but they seem to align fairly well with what Ian McGilchrist, of all people, identifies in terms of like how split brain patients render images with their hands. So
wow, okay. People who've undergone a commissurotomy.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And or people who have undergone the WADA procedure, which is no longer legal.
Right.
Where you anesthetize one side of the brain.
Yeah.
Wow, okay, I'm with you.
So the horse-bison pairing is interesting because horses stand on one toe, whereas bison stand on two toes.
Wow.
So this kind of pairing, I think, is significant because it broadly aligns with these two classes of so-called symbols in these caves, which are either expanding or contracting, which Ian McGilchrist, like I said, managed to map to the two hemispheres of the brain. So, so I have a lot of suspicions about that, but I'll leave it there, I suppose. Like, essentially, I suspect that writing originated in the context of this lateralization process or some kind of metacognition of that process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And there were these cosmic corollaries or environmental corollaries.
One of the most profound things that ever occurred to me, and it's not like I thought these things up on my own, I feel like they were given to me, like they were impressed upon me, rather than like, oh, these are Darren's inventions, isn't he, creatively imagined it. It's not what's going on at all. Sometimes, maybe, but not this one. So when the non-human intelligence was with me in the first time and I was inquiring into the origins of language and writing, it gave me this vision of like a primordial creature just making a mark with its claw or its tooth on a tree. And the realization that would allow the creature's spirit or intention to be encoded in light and cross time into other minds. So this is a mind transiting This is like a spaceship that uses light to cross the space between minds, right? This mark, the claw mark on the tree, doesn't have to be a letter, right? Tells every creature that sees it something about who was here, what did they mean, what am I supposed to get, like there's a transmission that happens across the light, across time, across space, across different bodies. This is very profound. This is shocking, right? We take these things for granted. We think, well, you just make marks on paper, it's just no big deal. Wrong. Those marks on paper connect minds that are dead minds to living minds. Think about that, right? This is not trivial. And similarly, the cave painting is something similar, except we don't know how to receive the transmission anymore. Most of us, I think, have forgotten.
Yeah.
There must be those of us who haven't forgotten or have spent their life. I think I read something about someone like this, right? Who spent, I think it was a man, his entire life just trying to learn to receive what was being transmitted, and had been, and the capacity for the reception of had been lost. Thoughts?
Yeah. Well, the different symbols seem to map fairly well to phosphine patterns, so that seems like a pretty promising lead to me. It's some kind of feedback mechanism. Yeah, that appears to have been the origin of writing, as far as I can tell.
Okay, so let's be really clear what you're saying about that so that other people can understand. I think you once said that under the influence of a certain substance, your vision, when you looked at it, for example, an object, you were seeing it sort of contract and then expand.
Right, yeah.
And what did you come to surmise from that?
So, yeah, perception involves this kind of dynamic equilibrium between filtration and feedback. So, perception is a kind of interplay between two fundamentally distinct processes. So, what happens during meditation or during psychedelic experiences is that you can become conscious through feedback of your own motor activity. So, you can become conscious of something in your environment which is really part of your own anatomy. So what you see as expansion and contraction in your environment is really reflective of your own pupillary action, for example. So you see externally something which is truly internal. So I think it actually arises because ordinarily our consciousness involves certain filters which are removed under special circumstances.
Or inhibited.
Inhibited, precisely.
Or transformed how they're filtering, or what they're filtering.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Or even the frequency of the filtering over some span, presuming that spans exist.
So the activity of the eye becomes perceptible to the eye itself.
Right.
So you start seeing these patterns and shapes.
Yes, so a common experience of people under the influence of psychedelics is that the landscape starts to sort of breathe, right? They call it breathing. And that's often part of the onset of what's going to become a much more intense transformation of the visual field. But that breathing is probably feedback from the disinhibition of filters.
Yeah.
Right? When we first started measuring, I don't know, actually, I'm going to rephrase that. In some research that attempted to do MRIs of people's brains under the influence of, I think, psilocybin, some neuroscientists were expecting that we would see hyperactivation of various parts of the brain. And if I understand the results correctly, I may be wrong, we can look this up later. What I recall is they were surprised to see unexpectedly broad deactivation of certain parts of the brain. Right. Now, this also reveals a sort of a myth about MRIs and brains. And one of those myths is that you can take snapshots of a river and understand what the river's doing, right? By just looking at these little snapshots, which is kind of insane. And the other thing that I think is silly and typical, I would do the same thing, obviously we would suppose that activation equals power, right? So, those things that are activated, that's the stuff that matters, right? When it turns out that as far as brains and nervous systems go, stuff that isn't active matters a lot too. And actually, you've probably heard this dumb phrase that, is old now and it's probably been mostly de-referenced or whatever. I don't know what the word I want is. Where you're only using 10% of your brain, right? I'm like, yeah, that's because if you were to use 80%, you'd explode. That wouldn't be a good thing. The 10% you're using is about the 10% you want active to not just be, dead or whatever. There's a bunch of weird tropes in our human knowledge systems that don't belong there, that are often the result of the mechanization of the meaning of features of activity, relation, circumstance, character, all these things, right? More is better, power is activation.
Yeah. Right.
I'll just mention one other thing. So, obviously, consciousness is very much an experience of a broad array of kinds of feedback, first. The other thing I don't want to lose track of, hopefully let me see here. Okay. Inhibition of that produces unexpected results. Inhibition of the filters that are usually in place, right? Which is part of what happens. This is what we're after with intoxication. We're not necessarily after activation, right? What we're after is, could you just turn that filter down a little bit? Let me feel oh wow, I can feel the way that thing is moving. I feel like I'm moving inside the way that thing is moving, right? My emotions are doing the dance and when you and I look at flowing water, we follow it, and then we look away and the reality's warping. We're getting a feel. We're getting a little bit of a taste of what I would call the photic driving, right? Which is the iterative restructuring of our visual experience and neurons perhaps over time. And then when we look away, it takes a while for them to adjust. So this thing's doing this, right? The wall's doing this or whatever after looking at the water moving. There's something I don't want to lose track of. The difference between sunlight and moonlight, right? Because it seems to me that sunlight, the symbol in the sunlight, or even the color or the shape in the sunlight, it is as if the sunlight declares things to you, right? It is blatantly obvious where that is, what it is, its color, and so forth. Whereas in the moonlight, not the same thing. Now you have the inhibition of the explicit, right? And so that means the suggestive. That might be a dragon's face in the tree bark. That looks like an animal over there that's scary, right? And it's just a rock. Is that a baby? Or, you can't tell what things are, and the color is not there. It's grayscale. And so the pareidolia becomes vastly enhanced in the presence of darkness or moonlight, which I think also is reminiscent of the difference between the masculine capacity to declare directly, to direct, and the brilliant mystery of the indirection of the feminine, to suggest, to lead by example, to inspire rather than to all of these things, right? The men often, right, they come face to face with each other. Women are more likely to sit beside each other. In general, there's all these little features of the differences between what we might think of as being somewhat idiosyncratically masculine and idiosyncratically feminine. But particularly with light and consciousness, I just want to distinguish these two things. Sunlight is intense, it's declarative, it tells you what stuff is. Moonlight doesn't do that. It asks you, how are you going to relate with that? You want to relate? Could be this, could be that. What do you think? There's an invitational, right? Whereas this is very much presentational. This is invitational, right? The denotative versus the connotative, the associative, right? The definition versus the connotation. So you were talking about feedback and filters.
Yes, yeah.
Please feel free to continue in whatever direction feels right.
Yeah, I mean, so like Goethe, for example, observed that color only arises through the limitation of light. So the idea of limitation, I think, is more generally bound up with perception or qualia. So I think that the idea of filtration is really at the core of perception in ways which modern neuroscience generally overlooks because we emphasize activation. But
right.
I think activation really deadens perception. If you accelerate some process within your brain, I suspect that you perceive less, not more. So yeah, you perceive more by inhibiting the propagation of a signal.
Yeah, I mean, there is. Say again?
Whereas like endeavors like Neuralink, I think, assume the opposite. If we simply speed up, like a computer, some information processing, then you'll become a genius. But I think you're actually going to lose some IQ points there.
That's a more complex supposition because I know people who. There are different kinds of people who can multi-process in ways that are astonishingly profound. I don't know if they're having intuitional superfunction or emotional superfunction, but they're certainly having something like cognitive and or intellectual superfunction. And some of these are like high-performing, uniquely minded people who might acquire labels related to autism or spectrum, stuff. But then there are also people who are, for example, yogis and gurus and things who can demonstrate ridiculous multi-processing of like doing 6 kind of math problems at the same time while writing a poem and I don't know what, dancing, or they can do a bunch of multi-processing things because the in this case, in the case of the yogi or the guru, I suspect that what's going on is the liberation of a bunch of energetic burdens that are ordinarily in place. So now they have new degrees of freedom that are uncommon for us, ordinary folks.
Right, yeah.
And go ahead, please.
Well, the sensation of freedom, I think, is related to inhibition. So the inhibition of that signal. Yeah. So as you descend to the condition of a material object, the dislocation or the separation between cause and effect collapses. So your perception, I think, correspondingly diminishes. So in other words, if you speed up some process within your nervous system, you're more bound up to become more like a material object than to become a free conscious agent. Yeah.
I mean, this gives us some insight into the profound effulgences of experience, relation, identity that occur during dreaming. Because now suddenly the nervous system is in a radically different state from what's going on while we're awake most of the time.
Yeah.
And so you have all this energy with which to, I mean, isn't it fascinating that given the opportunity, the mind naturally creates universes which disappear upon awakening? I mean, that's pretty remarkable in my view, right? That this naturally goes on all the time. And my Tai Chi teacher, when I used to ask him, my old Tai Chi teacher, Casey Mao, when I used to ask him about his dreams, because I was really curious, what does a Tai Chi, what does a Tai Chi teacher dream about? He was like, I don't dream. And he seemed to be disturbed by the question. I was like, what do you mean you don't dream? He's like, that dreaming stuff's that's just for people whose chi isn't flowing properly. Like, that's what happens when your chi's all plugged up, essentially, right? It's not flowing. When your chi is flowing naturally, everything is always healing and being regenerated. You say something like that. I don't necessarily believe that or know that it's true. I didn't trust it much at all when he first said it. I thought, this is a man who doesn't understand dreaming. Probably understands Tai Chi, but not dreaming. But I don't know. It's an interesting possibility.
Yeah.
Clearly, the dreaming does regenerate. Dreaming does a bunch of things that aren't just the mind making up universes.
Right.
It regenerates the organs, it cleans the blood, all kinds of crazy stuff are going on when we dream. It restructures the foundations of memory. Perhaps it's a way of actually repairing holophores, right? Because it brings connotative symbol, not just symbolic, but meta-symbolic identity, relational meaning, and so forth are reinvested in the elements at play in the dreamscape. It seems to me. Your thoughts?
Yeah, dreaming is clearly bound up with memory. I suspect that dreaming is related to what I mentioned in terms of filtration and feedback, their association or their separation.
Mm-hmm. We agree about this.
Yeah.
I mean, filtering can be thought of as buffering. It can also be thought of as inhibition.
Right. Yeah.
And let's be really clear, if you had no inhibition, your chance to pick up that glass would be zero.
Right. Yeah.
Right? You just, right, you wouldn't be able to move articulately. Movement requires both things. Successful articulation, like crossing the space and grasping and all these things, involve both feedback and inhibition.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
We don't usually think of inhibition as power, but the concept of power would be useless if there were no buffering, no inhibition.
Right.
You'd never be able to articulate the power in any way that was useful. However, I want to hear more about the problem of utility, as you brought it up earlier, and how something's been happening over the development of our species where, in order to emphasize this concept of utility, we're being deprived of and perhaps enslaved or broken in some way. Please say more about this.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it might have something to do with trade, mercantilism, or money, like the evolution of money, because money appears to have evolved from technical objects. So, yeah, the first forms of money were really just tools, which were deliberately destroyed or tarnished. So, for example, like spearheads were used as forms of money in the ancient past. Or broken fishhooks were used as forms of money. Yeah, so there appears to have been this process of ritually destroying certain like technical icons and then using them as media of exchange. So yeah, money and technology are interwoven there. But yeah, the idea of denominating beings in terms of a single unit or metric is precisely analogous to the issue of measurement that we discussed earlier. It's the same kind of mode of thinking. It's, the idea that we can subordinate the totality of our environment to a single, homogeneous unit, which itself is devoid of value, but because of its, dearth of qualities can be used to measure anything qualitative. Yeah, that whole paradigm, I think, is... Yeah, it both underpins our concept of money and the technological infrastructure of our concept of science. So those, in my view, those two developments are together. They belong together.
I'm reminded of having heard a story, perhaps possibly in the dawn of everything, where unlike possibly your common suppositions about, look, money is one of the worst ideas that has ever been implemented on any planet anywhere around here. It's just devastating. It's the representation. It's the collapsed representation of all forms of value, right? So once you got that, all those other things can't compete with it, and they get ruined. Right? It just breeds bad behavior, basically.
Yeah.
it's one of the most perverse incentives you could possibly have. But
yeah. Well, the idea of use at a deeper level, I think, is really a matter of being controlled. So it's the exact opposite of what we tend to think. So, you know, I think that I use a tool, but really what happened is that I lost something, and now I find myself being used by some like infrastructure. Like,
yeah,
that's.
I mean, the automobile is a great example, right? You're being used by the automobile. You have to pay for it has to occupy space, the road occupies space, all that space is dead. When the car isn't moving you, it's not a car, it's just there, it's a thing. You have to pay the insurance, you gotta fill it with gas, you have to make a space for it, you have to try to keep it safe and protected and all these things, right? So and then the car uses your civilization to reproduce itself at ever increasing costs over its evolutionary time, that's costing the possible evolution and preservation of vast arrays of organisms and beings, not to mention the fact that it kills damn near everything it touches without any sort of like relational integrity whatsoever. Just touch, die all day long, right? I mean, we used to drive, back in the day when there were insects, you know, before DDT, you drive like 50 miles and there'd be squashed insects all over your car, you know, like hundreds of them. All the different kinds, you could see them dead on the car. Now you drive your car 100 miles, there's no insects. 2, maybe, none, you know. It's weird, it's terrifying, like the thing just kills by existing. And so, yeah, we get used by our tools.
Well, similarly, we tend to think that money is something that we need to acquire. Money somehow is substantial, but really money is the embodiment of debt. Money is the embodiment of something absent. So the wealthiest people in our civilization are those who actually dispense money, who get rid of money. So the wealthiest people in our civilization are those who lend money. They don't want money. They want you to have the money. Right?
Yeah,
because you're the one who's supposed to be in debt.
Right.
So
that's brilliant. Yeah, the irony. But what I was reading that I thought was very cool was that these, I can't remember exactly what was going on, but here's my presentation of it for what it's worth. There were these island cultures. They could get to each other, but it's a lot of trouble to get to each other. And so they invented this game of trade where they would trade like shells or whatever. Let's say these little shells they're curved and they have a sort of comb-like structure on the bottom. I can't remember what they're called. Cowrie shells, maybe? They would gather up these cowrie shells, which are plentiful on the beaches. It's not like you have to go hunt cowries or anything. Just gather up the shells, and then they would get together to trade them because it's really fun to hang out with the neighboring island people. You can make food, and you know, women, men exchange, and children to play together and stuff. So they would do this trade thing not because they cared about the cowrie shells, but they wanted something, a reason to like come together and have this fun. Right, and have the cultural exchange. And that's a very charming vision of the possibilities of trade that I think is, I don't think that was invented. I think they like talked to these people, and the people basically said like, yeah, we have this stuff that we trade, but it's not because the stuff's important. We like to get together and, you know, have fun and be human and share stories and learn things and make stuff together and whatever. So it's not all bad, this commodification thing, but the money is pretty much all bad. I mean, it's just death, you know. It's blood and suffering and omnicide and ecocide represented, right, like condensed into this stuff that we track in banks, and just terrifyingly stupid idea. And no one would ever sign up for that if they felt they had any choice. Nobody would opt in. It would be 0 people.
Yeah.
It's just that we acquire the mores, expectations, behaviors, and impoverishments that are natural, that are embedded in our time, place, and the people that we were born with and come up with. We reiterate those fictions almost like the opposite of the form of the salamander, right? That rises again and again in time, echoing into the future, This is the opposite of that. This is a death from the future traveling, like an empty, fossilized doom, traveling backward
Precisely, yeah.
into representational expression and enaction. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really trippy to think of it that way.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the death inside time of the time being. I mean, I do think of time as a being, actually, or transcendental to a being, but not a thing and not stuff. Myself, it's a body that is transcendent or something, right? For me.
Right. Yeah, the movement within technology, I think, goes from the circle to the ray. So, settled life, cities, and technology all cleave feedback loops and render them flat. So
wow, yeah.
basically, we take natural cycles, flatten them, and then call that economic value. And I mentioned earlier how, like, you know, in a city, you move shit, but you stay stationary.
Right.
So basically, you're
The shit moves and you're frozen.
right.
Normally, you would move and the shit would just sit there.
It's the inversion, precisely like you were saying. It's this temporal inversion of what would be really a circle or a
what would be alive, actually.
Yeah.
It's an inversion of living.
Yeah. So the whole concept of waste is at the foundation of what we call economic behavior. But as soon as we move shit, we call it waste. We need to start working in a frenzy to make up for the loss of the shit that we transported. Right?
Yeah.
Whereas, I mean, the planet doesn't need to do that, right?
Right.
Yeah. So, yeah, waste is really waste, not value, is the foundational concept of economics. Without waste, without cleaving these natural cycles, there can be nothing of economic value. So yeah, I think you're quite right. Seeing it as this inversion makes a lot of sense.
It's death making.
Yeah.
Death and debt. These are much closer than they seem.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
It's not an accident, that resemblance. The tokenization of value, though, is one of the most terrifying things humans have ever done. It just leads to every kind of disaster and colonizing rape and just ruination. So, you know, I'd like to think that throughout our conversation, without having intended to do so, we've accidentally practiced the authentic disclosure that we hinted at the possibility of in the beginning. What do you think?
Aletheia?
Aletheia, yeah. Aletheia.
The unforgetting,
Yeah.
or the disclosure.
Yes. Disclosure.
Yeah.
Right, the unclosing. Beautiful.
Unconcealment.
Yes. And the discovery. Like literally, disc over y. Right? Disc over y. I'm grateful. Hopefully these conversations will continue in a similar or related form in the near future. Appreciate you, man.
Likewise. Love you.
Love you too. Just for now.